Hey everybody, good afternoon. I'm Kelsey Misbrenner, Senior Editor with Solar Power World magazine. We're a magazine for U.S. solar installers with a mission to help them do their jobs better. You can subscribe for free to our print magazine or our e-newsletters at solarpowerworldonline.com. Today we're here to talk about the historic new mandate of solar on all new homes in California. The California Electric Commission's decision opens up great possibilities for the solar industry. We've gathered some experts here to explain the technical requirements, options for builder compliance, and market opportunities for deploying and financing solar on all new homes. Our objective is for you to come away from this session with a good understanding of the opportunities available with the new mandate, any challenges you might face, and how to overcome them. I'd like to introduce you to our expert speakers now. We have Joe Kane, Director of Codes and Standards at SEIA, Mazi Sharak, Senior Engineer and Technical Lead for Zero Net Energy and Building Energy Efficiency Standards for the California Energy Commission. We have Richard Brown, CEO at solar thermal company Power Panel. We have Megan Cordes, Lead Technical Consultant for the California Building Industry Association for the 2019 standards. And we have Matt Brost, Sales Director at SunPower. So Joe, would you mind starting us off with a high-level overview of the new mandate?
Sure, thank you. Happy to be here on behalf of SEIA to give this presentation. I'll kind of set things up and also give some of the technical requirements that are most impactful for the industry, and then we'll move on to Mazi giving us more of the overview and concept of how these standards came into effect. So first I like to start with a little bit of information about kind of scale. And so our SEIA, along with GTM Research, does a market study each quarter. And this is not updated to Q2, but I like the number from Q1 because there's 2.5 gigawatts of solar installed in the US. And I like that number because I have an easy reference point for it, in that Diablo Canyon is about 2.55 gigawatts. And so in one quarter, in the US, we installed the same capacity as one nuclear power plant. It's kind of an easy metric to think about. There's another metric that I actually like to think about too, and that one is that can power also approximately 2 time-traveling DeLoreans. So I always kind of keep that in mind. So in the meantime, nearly 56 gigawatts total installed capacity in the US, which is really phenomenal. In Q1, 55% of all new electric capacity installed was solar. And prices have dropped 52% in 5 years, just in the last 5 years. But those price declines have started to slow. And we know that soft cost is still the objective in getting those out. But now in terms of quantity, 1.7 million solar installations in the US in terms of Q1 2018, and expected to be about 4 million by 2023, which is really huge. Now in terms of state breakdown, California remains #1 solar state, and that is interesting because we are here talking about even more solar in California. I always find interesting, #2 state is North Carolina. That's mostly on the utility side, and that's what spurred that development. But then it's also interesting to see some other states coming up, like Texas and Utah and Florida on the list, and Georgia. But there's your top 10. In terms of residential systems and kind of tracking price for residential systems, there have been continued drops in the cost of residential, but as the residential cost continues to drop and the gains are flattening out a little bit, but you can see that the soft cost component of solar is an increasing percentage, and there are initiatives to deal with that, including the solar app campaign, which was just announced in a press release a couple of days ago, and it will be a big permitting issue on a nationwide campaign. But in the context of new homes, what we mostly experienced is installing solar on existing buildings, existing homes, with some of the major companies having new home teams that have worked with major developers to partner and to install solar. But in this California solar requirement, we're going to see the number of new homes with solar increase from about, as Mazi would say, about 15,000 homes per year today to close to 100,000 new homes per year in California, which is a pretty big deal. And so Along with that, though, is to think about is in the cost of solar and how this will impact cost. Those same types of efficiencies that cause developers to do subdivisions with dozens of homes or even hundreds of homes will help the cost of solar. So, for example, moving a crew from one lot to the next lot to the next lot without additional truck rolls for individual stages of construction, I think that the residential install systems in these subdivisions will see those same types of gains and economies of scale. And to get a picture of the overall, how many new homes are we doing per year, the Census Bureau publishes the results, and you can see that nationwide about 1.3 million new homes in the U.S. each year, and in California approximately 115,000 new homes per year. So you can see that this really is a very large market and will be very impactful. To set the stage, in Mozzie's talk when he talks about California climate zones, for those who may not have seen this map before, this is what we're talking about. Is California is broken up into 16 individual climate zones. These are different from what you would see in other codes, such as the International Energy Conservation Code, which has essentially 6 climate zones across the entire U.S. The California Energy Standards have the state split up into 16 distinct climate zones, each of which has a representative city for purposes of compliance and modeling. And so in terms of what is the actual requirement, this is the charging language that we're looking at, and it's in the prescriptive section of the code. But it essentially says that the annual electrical output of PV, at a minimum, equal to or greater than the dwelling's annual electrical usage. And here's the formula that will be used to do that, and developed by the Energy Commission, with some variables in there, such as conditioned floor area, number of dwelling units, and then some factors that are essentially some adjustment factors that come out of a table by climate zone. So that's what we're looking at. And then the mention of Joint Appendix JA11 is where you find the qualifying conditions for a PV system that would meet the code. And so this formula will tell you what the minimum size is, the minimum qualifying size. That's not necessarily what you'll install on the home, because you're going to want to size the system for the actual demand that you anticipate, including, maybe there's an EV charger, maybe there's something else that's not included in these minimum code provisions. And then on the upper end, this energy code doesn't establish a maximum. That's established by the whatever your installation is in terms of interconnection. So think of this as a bracket. The formula is a minimum qualifying size. The interconnection rules will establish the maximum size that you can install, and we are strongly encouraged to continue to communicate with the utility for interconnection rules. Now, along with this are some exceptions to the PV. So say, for instance, I'm in the shade of a mountain, or I'm in a rural area and I'm surrounded by trees and I'm not going to cut them all down. So there may be some very legitimate reason why you're not going to install solar based on solar access. Now, these exceptions, there are 6 of them, and I have to say that this is probably going to be one of the most challenging parts of the entire code in order to interpret, in order to implement, in order to enforce. And so we've had numerous conversations with Mozzie and other staff at the California Energy Commission about what does this mean, how is it implemented, how is it going to the software, and Mozzie can talk about that a little bit later. But one of the things that's challenging is that sometimes it's in the context of there's not enough solar resource based on shade, and sometimes it's in the context of there's not enough space on a particular roof to install the number of panels you would need to meet the minimum. So without digging too deeply into these individual exceptions, you'll just see that there are 6 of them, most of which have to do with solar access, and a term that probably needs a little bit more work to define, or to give some examples in the manual on how to use this. So those are the exceptions. I'm not going to spend much time on this because we could talk all day about these exceptions. So there's exception 4, there's exception 5, and again, these are related to space, related to solar access, and there's exception 6, which actually allows downsizing of a PV system if batteries are installed. There's kind of an interesting kind of a condition in the code where there are some cases, this exception 6, where adding a battery would allow you to decrease the size of the PV system installed from the minimum required. And there's another case where that probably Megan will talk about that is would allow you to upsize the PV system if you install batteries and use it for compliance. So these are some of the deeper issues that are involved, and probably in this session, maybe there'll be some questions that may come up, but again, it's something that I wouldn't expect everybody to understand the first time you're exposed to it. So in this Joint Appendix JA11, there are a number of qualifying criteria that are established, and some of them have to do, again, with orientation, with shading, solar access verification. One of the important ones is the system monitoring that will be, it's becoming more and more common to have system monitoring so that a customer can actually see what their system is producing. I don't know whether 100% of systems have it, but it's very common. But at this point, it will be required so that the homeowner, consumer can actually see the system, and there's some reporting standards in there. And then, of course, interconnection requirements. The one that I'm going to highlight is this one on system orientation because this was a big point of testimony that I provided and others at the California Energy Commission hearings that went along with the development of the standards, workshops and hearings. And so their first pass is the 150 to 270 degrees was the qualifying range. And when we said, well, okay, but that's a pretty tight range of orientation for a PV system on a home, and we think it's too restrictive. So that range expanded, and then there came a point during public testimony where I thought, like, I'm going to be the guy standing at the microphone saying we should have PV system allowed to be due north, and I did. And some people think that may be unrealistic, but really when you're talking about a subdivision and you're talking about, say for instance, my subdivision, I have Plan 1, Plan 2, Plan 3, different home sizes, and each of those has an elevation A, B, and C. So I have 1B and a 2C, or whatever it may be. And then I have a curvy street with a cul-de-sac, and I need to be able to put any home, any plan set, any elevation on any lot at any orientation. Really, we thought it was best to not have orientation restrictions on the PV system and just simply have a way so that the computer modeling could take into account the performance of the system regardless of orientation. So we're able to work with staff and get that to be in the standard. So the typical range is 90 to 300. However, if you plug it into the computer software, it can be at any orientation. And then the CFI range is still that 150 to 270. And I don't know whether Mazi may want to touch on that a little bit more when he has the microphone, but that's the basic thing, is that your orientation restrictions are relaxed, and as long as the system performs and as long as the system is producing power and it's modeled correctly, you can use it. Okay, and then a new certificate of installation will be developed and uploaded to California approved registry. Now that means that, what that means is that taking the burden off of the enforcement agency, the building department, not requiring them to know too much or to go too deep on energy performance of a PV system, because their primary job is safety, and to put that burden back on the installing contractor to essentially fully document the system, how it's installed, and so that the point where it puts the burden on the installer, and then the enforcement agency simply needs to be able to go through and make sure those forms are filled out and make sure that they're uploaded to the registry, and it makes the building inspector's job easier. Battery storage, I think Megan will probably talk about this. We were successful in talking to the commission about having options for compliance that are more flexible for the builder, to allow the builder to essentially install features that are marketable, that are productive, that are energy saving, but also to be able to choose the most cost-effective and marketable option for them. And so there was a lot of dialogue in the testimony about, we don't want to allow somebody to install PV and then use that to install something less in an efficiency measure. And trade-off is sort of a bad word to folks who are efficiency oriented in Some people feel the California has what's called a loading order, which does mean efficiency is in first position. But allowing to get to a certain level of efficiency and then say, yeah, but we do have some flexibility once you've attained a certain threshold does make sense. And so the batteries have been accepted as an option to do that, and that's in the software and the modeling. For the battery storage systems, the qualifying requirements are in Joint Appendix J812, and for batteries, just the minimum threshold is 5 kilowatt hours of installed capacity. That is pretty small. Most batteries on the marketplace will be usually larger than that threshold. And then there's some trip efficiency and some other cycling retention that required. Community shared solar is also included in the standard, and the Commission recognizes that, especially when that the solar can't always be on site. For various reasons, you might need to use off-site renewable energy and even off-site batteries. And so that will become increasingly important as California moves towards zero net energy or zero carbon for commercial buildings. If you're in an urban area and you have tall, high-rise buildings, you're not going to be able to get all the solar capacity you need on that building, so it's going to have to be off-site. This is really a first step and a very important and critical step that the Commission took in order to set up a criteria for off-site solar through community shared solar, electric, and batteries. So again, not diving too deep into this, but saying there's a whole new section in the code related to these shared facilities. The biggest issue is going to be how to legally and contractually tie them to the system. There are some things also in the California policy and legislation. The GTSR, Green Tariff Shed Renewable Program, is not entirely up to speed with what it needs to happen in order to implement this. So we have some work to do through the legislature as well as through these code proceedings. And then as we move to this, we're going to need to do this. Okay, so just really quickly, in terms of the effective date, the effective date is going to be January 1st, 2020, and it's based on the date of application for permit. There will be some cases where there's master plan approval, so somebody has submitted these model types 1, 2, 3, and 4 for plan check, but they haven't pulled permits for individual lots. So in terms of residential subdivisions, master plan approval will play into this. And usually what we see is a rush for permits before the effective date, so you can kind of expect that January 1st, 2020 being the cutoff, there's going to be, the building departments are going to be really busy the last 2 weeks of December. Anyway, so for that reason, you won't see like a hard cutover of residential installs, immediately overnight jumping. You will see a ramping up. So anyway, that's the overview and the setup, and then we'll turn this over to Mazi and let him take the next section. Thank you.
So good afternoon. I'm Mazi Shirak, and I'm going to be talking about the newly adopted code by the Commission, the 2019 standards. You may know that back in May of this year, the Energy Commission adopted the 2019 standards that for the first time included provisions for the photovoltaic requirements. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the background, how we ended up here, and what those requirements are, and what are the tools that we have developed to help people comply with the standards. To begin with, we set ourselves 6 goals for this round of standards. And the first one, which is always the top of our order, is increasing buildings' energy efficiency as cost-effectively as possible. During this whole ZNE effort, we've introduced new envelope measures into the buildings that we call things like high-performance attics, high-performance walls, better appliances, high-efficiency appliances, tight ducts, and so forth, to reduce the amount of electricity and energy that the building uses. We also wanted to contribute to states' important greenhouse gas reduction goals, which we have, and we also wanted to reduce the home's impact on the grid through more efficiency, the right-sized PV system, and also incorporating grid harmonization strategies. that maximize the self-utilization of the PV output. Also providing independent compliance path for mixed fuel homes and all electric homes, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, and also providing tools for Part 11, these are the reach codes, stretch codes that the local governments may adopt. We want to provide the tools so they can comply with that. Going back in history, the Z&Es was set for us back in 2008 and during Arnold Schwarzenegger's administration. And there were several other our sister agencies that was involved in this, the California Public Utilities Commission and also the California Air Resources Board. And this effort continued under Governor Brown. When the Z&E was introduced 10 years ago, it was relatively a simple goal, make the building as energy efficient as possible, and then provide some amount of renewables PV system that will offset the annual energy consumption of the home. But reality always turns out to be a little bit more complicated than we envisioned. During the intervening 10 years, there's been a lot of new developments. For instance, the large utility deployment of PVs as a result of the 50% RPS has implications for the grid and for the building standards. Also, emergence of the net energy metering rules and all time of use compensations for residential buildings also plays a big role in how we approached it. And one of the issues is that the current NEM rules, or net energy metering rules, it treats the grid as if the grid is this vast virtual storage where you can over-generate part of the day and then use it later on. Or worse yet, you can over-generate part of the year, like in summertime, and use it in the winter, when in reality the grid has very little storage capacity. So we need to be mindful of those developments. So therefore, we talk about this concept of grid harmonization. And what is grid harmonization? These are strategies that, if they're implemented correctly, they bring the maximum benefit to the grid and the environment and the occupants. And the definition of grid harmonization are the strategies and measures that harmonizes customer-owned distributed energy resources system with the grid in a way that it maximizes self-utilization of the PV's output and minimizes exports back to the grid. In other words, any measure that helps us use the PV's output on the site and not send it back to the grid. So examples would be obviously things like battery storage, thermal storage, demand response measures, and in the future we think EVs are going to play a role in this. This is a famous duck curve. I think you've all seen it. This is a Cal ISO curve that I've borrowed, and what this denotes is this problem of having too much solar generation in this state on mild and sunny days, to the point that sometimes we have to actually give it away to the neighboring states. So, and that's one reason why I included this, and also and that the table to the right under solution, that the first two measures that they've identified is targeting energy efficiency and using storage to basically mitigate the impact of this duck curve. And later, below, it also talks about using the time of use rate schedules to also address it. So, these are all the things that we have to consider. So this table shows how we can deal with the duck curve. This is a home that we modeled. This is a 2,700 square foot home in Sacramento, California, which has relatively hot summers. This is on August 6th. And what you see here, that the red graph is the load that the grid sees as a result of this house. And what does that red graph look like? It looks a lot like this duck curve. So even though this is a very efficient building and it has about 3 kilowatt PV system, What the grid sees is a building that actually, it's a lot like that dark curve. It's not helping the grid. So what happens if we add a grid harmonization technologies like battery storage to this building? And what you'll see is that blue line. And what's interesting, the blue line, and you'll see that for most of the day, that line is hugging the 0 kilowatt line, which means the house is not drawing any power from the grid. So for 20 out of 24 hours, this house is self-sufficient, and then for 4 hours is actually sending electricity back to the grid. So that's how we can achieve real zero net energy in a way that doesn't harm the grid. So putting all that together, our 2019 approach included envelope efficiency measures. Again, we introduced high performance attics, high performance walls, quality insulation installation, and better windows. These were measures that we introduced in 2016 and 2013 standards in order to reduce the energy consumption of the home. And also step 2 or goal number 2 was appropriately sized PV systems. And I'll explain in a minute what that means, appropriately sized. And again, having a path, independent path for all electric and mixed fuel homes, and then grid harmonization strategies. What I need to mention here that in the 2019 standards, the PV is a requirement, but battery storage is not. That's what we call a compliance option. It's an option that the builders have. So every measure that we introduce into the standards, whether it's an energy efficiency or renewable, must be cost effective. And we have to demonstrate that it is cost effective using life cycle costing methodology. And we also are bound by net energy metering requirements, which basically says you cannot put a PV system that over-generates relative to the energy or electrical consumption of that house. And what NEM rules do is they specify that in as long as your production is at or below the annual consumption of the house, you can get full retail compensation for it. But if you exceed that, you only get something like 3 cents a kilowatt hour. That's how they're trying to discourage oversizing the PV system. So using life cycle costing and NEM rules, we found that PV systems that are sized to offset the annual electricity use of the house is very cost effective in all 16 of our climate zones.
Yay.
So therefore, here comes the sun. For the first time, the 2019 standards included provisions for PVs for buildings, and I think this is the first anywhere in the country or perhaps everywhere. Now, there are some exceptions, as Joe just mentioned, is shading due to external barriers. And also, if you have buildings that are more than 1 story, 2 or 3 stories, you may have limited roof space. Walking the halls here, these new panels, you have many of them. They can pack 350 to 380 watts into one module. I'm kind of optimistic that most buildings can actually accommodate the full requirement without any variance. But we do have some variances for 2 and 3 stories buildings. And we also have some variances for buildings whose master plan were approved before the effective date, but the permits may be pulled after the effective date. So for those buildings, there are some provisions. As Joe said, this is a kind of a discussion that needs a lot of explaining. But what we've done, we have a companion document. It's called the Residential Compliance Manual. I'm providing a link to that document later on in this. And in that document, we've really tried to explain these requirements and all the exceptions. And what's really helpful, we have a series of questions and answers. So, it can really explain this in a way that, I have this home, it's two stories or 3 stories, it has a limited roof, how do I comply with that? And we've really tried to explain it in simple English. So my suggestion is to consult this Residential Compliance Manual, Chapter 7. If you have any questions, call us and, we'll help you with it. One of the things we do in the standards is we try to provide flexibility into the standards as much as possible, whether it's energy efficiency features or renewables. Most people, when we talk about the PV requirements, they envision rooftop PV systems, which is one option. And also, most people assume that these PV systems have to be outright from the onset. Again, that's only one option. The other one is to lease the PV system. The differences are that with the outright purchase, you have a larger first cost, but you also have larger monthly savings. With the leased systems, there's little or no upfront cost, but there are smaller monthly savings. So, choose whatever meets your need, and different builders are adopting different approaches. In fact, I think Lennar, which is one of the largest builders in the country, they're going with the lease options, but others are going with the outright purchase. And there's also going to be community solar options that, as Joe mentioned, that when they become available, they can be used as an alternative to on-site PV systems. So far, we do not have any community solar plans that have been approved by the Energy Commission, but at least one utility, SMUD, in Sacramento, they're going to be coming forward with a plan, and we're hoping others will follow. And these systems, these plans will have to meet all the criteria that we have spelled out in section 10-115 of the standards. So for instance, for the energy performance, these plans, even though they're not on site, but as far as energy is concerned, they must perform as if they were a rooftop PV system. The energy savings that are dedicated into a home must also be comparable to what an on-site PV system would have produced. And also durability is an important element, that this plan must be dedicated to the building for at least 20 years. And it will have to stay with the building for 20 years. In other words, if the first owner sells the house and moves, this will stay back with the building as if it was an on-site PV system. Joe talked about Joint Appendix 11 and 12, very important. He mentioned the orientation requirements. He said, he wants the PV panels to face due north. If you use our compliance software, you can actually face your panel due north, but we don't recommend it, because what happens when you face your panel away, the optimal range is south to southwest. That's when the utility needs it the most. That's when the rates are the highest, and that's when you get most of the benefit. So when you deviate from that, you're going to get, first your production is going to go down, and then the value of that generated kilowatt hour is going to go down, which is what we call time-dependent valuation, or TDV. So if you have a PV system that's facing northeast, for instance, it does two things that works against you. First, it's producing electricity at the wrong time of the day, early in the morning, and so the cost is low, so you're not going to get the benefits from your PV system. And then, again, it's wrong time and low cost. And the result is that you have to put a much bigger PV system to compensate for those losses. So our recommendation is as close to south and west as possible. Another document, as Joe mentioned, J12, these are the qualifications for battery storage system. I don't know if there's anybody here that sells battery storage. This morning, Megan and I, we walked in that corner where all the storage people are, and we're trying to tell them that they really need to become familiar with JA12 because not any battery is going to comply with these standards. They have to be JA12 compliant, and they have to certify their batteries to the Energy Commission that they are JA12 compliant. And what does JA12 do? If you have a battery system that's only capable of using backup power, that doesn't bring any value to the grid or the homeowner. So we want PV systems that can actually work with the grid, with the time of use differentials to bring these benefits to the homeowner and the grid. And JA12 ensures that that happens. So again, very important to comply with JA12 if you're selling batteries in this state. Another concept we're introducing is what we call the energy design rating. And this energy design rating, or EDR, is going to be used to demonstrate compliance with the 2019 standards. This is a change from the previous cycles. And what this does, the EDR uses a reference building. In this case, is a 2006 IECC building, and compares your proposed building to this reference building. So if you build a building that performs just as good or bad as a 2006 IECC, you get an EDR score of 100. Z&E by definition is an EDR score of 0. So most buildings are going to be someplace between 100 and 0. For the 2019 standards, for energy efficiency measures only, the EDR score is in the mid-40s. When you add the PV system to it, the EDR score is going to be 25. So we're not getting to the full Z&E score of 0, but we're about 75 to 80% there. Another benefit of EDR is that it provides a performance target for the builders, and the builders have the flexibility to get to that target any way they want. That's why they like it. They can have more energy efficiency, they can have more demand response, they can have more battery storage, and they can do trade-offs with the PV system. And each builder is developing their own package based on their philosophy to meet these goals. And this was very popular with the builders. So this is a screenshot of the software that we have developed. We call that CBEC Res. This is probably the premier software for residential simulation on the planet. It's available to all of you for free. And I am providing a link. This software can do both simulation for energy efficiency features of the building and also for PV system, battery storage system, demand response, pre-cooling, and also thermal, solar thermal and everything else. And so again, you can use the software to demonstrate compliance both with the energy efficiency features and the PV and the battery storage systems. For all electric homes, this is something that we're trying to encourage because the state's policy is actually shifting from zero net energy to zero carbon and emissions. And all electric option is the one that gets us closest to the lowest or zero emission from the homes. And I'll show that in a little bit. But for all electric homes to work, we need to be using heat pump or heat pump technology for both space heating and water heating. So, we actually had serious people coming to us and say, hey, if you're putting PVs on the roof, why not use resistance heating? As if now the electricity is too cheap to meter. And the answer is no. We need to be using the most efficient technologies that is available to us, which is both heat pump for space heating and water heating. And for water heating, what you probably need to do is put a NEOT Tier 3 heat pump water heater to comply. So what are the sizes of the PV systems that we're talking about for 2019 standards? As you can see here, the average statewide system that's going to go on single-family homes is about 2.8 kilowatts. This is for a 2,500 square foot home. It varies by the size of the home and the climate zone, and I've listed some of the climate zones down there. Take your favorite. We're close to Disneyland, so let's take climate zone 8, and the PV size that's going to go on a typical home here is about 2.9 kilowatts on a 2,700 square foot home. By contrast, the average size of PV that's going on existing homes, it's about 7.2 kilowatts. So 2.8 is a lot smaller than 7.2. Again, the reason for that is 2019 standard building compliant buildings are much more efficient than existing buildings, and also because of NEM rules, we're just sizing this to be right size. And for those two reasons, the size is much smaller than what's going on in existing homes. Now that we're talking about emissions from the homes, let's take a look and see how much progress we've made with these standards. And this table is meant to demonstrate that. If you're living in an existing home that's about, 15, 16, 17, 18 years old, that house is probably generating about 6.5 metric tons of CO2 a year. If we switch to a 2006 compliant home, that goes down to around 3.3 metric tons. And a 2019 compliant home brings that down to around 2.1 metric tons per year. But now, if we switch to an all-electric home with appropriate sized PV and battery storage system, we can get this all the way down to 0.2, which is very close to zero. And again, that's why we are trying to encourage all electric homes, because with the right technologies, we're virtually generating no CO2 from that home. We're also going to have stretch codes in the state, which are called CalGreen, or Part 11. And these are going to be codes that are going to be adopted by local jurisdictions, cities and counties throughout the state. And what they might do is specify targets that are even stricter than the base code. And there's going to be two tiers in there, Tier 1 and Tier 2. And I've only presented scenarios for 2 climate zones, 3 in San Francisco and climate zone 12 in Sacramento. And the possible targets are about EDR score of between 10 to 14 for Tier 1 and full Z&E for Tier 2. And the builders can use a combination of more energy efficiency, larger PV system, and battery storage system to get to these lower EDR targets. So what's in store for 2022? Again, we're switching to CO2 emission metrics from Z&E. We're moving away from that. And we're also going to be focusing on high-rise residential and non-residential buildings. Up to this point, our focus has been on low-rise residential and single-family, but now we're going to be focusing on high-rise residential and single-family. And we're probably going to be starting with retail, offices, and warehouse from the outset. So just some quick note about the tools. As I mentioned, we are producing, we have developed the software, which is called CBEC Res, that you can use. Everything that I've mentioned here, the CBEC Res can do for you. And it can evaluate for your energy efficiency features, the PVs, storage, demand response, and everything else. And these are some screenshots from this software. This is the PV screen where you describe the attributes of your PV system. It's the sizes, number of strings, the type of panels you have, standard panels, premium panels, the orientation and all that. And what you see to the right is called exceptions. Those exceptions that Joe and I talked about are actually incorporated into the software. So if you qualify for one of those, you can actually go in there and select that, and the software will help you, through that for compliance. And so the second one here is the battery storage tab, where you describe the attributes of your battery storage system, the capacity in kilowatt hours, what kind of control system you have. In this case, it's time of use and the round trip efficiency of the battery storage system. And these are the references, if you want to download, the 2019 building standards. The second one is a reference for Joint Appendix 11 and 12. And that residential compliance manual that I mentioned is there. You click on that and you pick Chapter 7, and you can review the language we're adding for PVs and for battery storage. And then the last one is where you can download the software that I just talked about. And if you have any questions, you can send me or Danny an email. Thank you.
All right. Excuse me. All right, let's talk more about the options that builders have for compliance with the new mandate. So Richard, can you go next and talk about power panel? And
Gladly. First off, try to wake everybody up here a little bit. I know because we get these technical things and it's important information, but sometimes we get a little bit lost in the weeds. Overall, how many people in here have ever installed PV thermal of any type? Okay, I got somebody in the back corner, and that's it. Okay, so hopefully I'll be brief, but I will tell you what's going on the thermal side of things. I actually come from a PV background myself. I've been doing multifamily affordable for the last 4 or 5 years. And before that, I worked on schools and some commercial buildings, federal government. And thermal has always been a good idea. It's been with us a long time. But of course, we used it at the time of the Egyptians 2,000 years ago. So before that. But it's fallen out of, not so much out of favor, but PV has been hot and sexy and all these great enhancements and panels. And we've seen a lot of new things happening in the last few years and improvements in the inverters. But I'm here to actually speak both as a consultant, having worked with clients, and also working with Power Panel now as a manufacturer's rep and helping them with business development. Thermal is still here, and it's getting better. Okay. Forward, right? There we go. Okay, solar thermal in California 2020. There's no requirement to use solar thermal at all. It's an option to help you get to net zero and meet your requirements. There are some incredibly great rebates that are still in place throughout the entire state. Most of the tax incentives, of course, are slowly decreasing, but the rebates in all the utility areas, throughout our entire state, are still there. Very few areas that do not have any, and they're still in place through July 2020. In fact, the great majority of the state is still in Tier 1, so some really good money there. To explain that, PG&E, SDG&E through CSI, Southern California Gas, SCG, are all step 1. Just to give you an idea, a house, you can get $29.85 per therm in rebate. That really helps you pay for a system. If it is a affordable house, you go all the way up to $36.90. So you can see a large portion of the cost paid for by rebate, just like it was in the early days of PV. Multifamily residential, you're looking at $20.19 and $24.89 per therm. Again, really good returns. You combine that with your federal tax credit, and the majority of the cost of the system are covered. This gets your returns all the way down to anywhere from 3 to 8 years, depending upon that particular configuration that you've designed. Commercial and industrial is still at 2019. Okay, and these rebates will start going down probably starting next year as we start going into step 2 where they drop. Commercial pools, for a while there was nothing. It was just kind of a no-brainer. Now you get $5 a therm again. Right now there's over 8,400 applications to date under the program, and so far we're saving over 7 million therms annually, and that translates to about 750,000 kilowatt hours. Okay. Thermal strategy in California. If you notice there on the left, that's Power Panel. That's my product. I thought I'd get at least one free plug-in since I, you know, decided to participate, was kindly asked to do so. Power Panel, I'll just say this real quickly, is a joint PV thermal panel all-in-one. It's a U.S. manufactured panel. Right now, our only competition is some products coming out of Europe. So this is U.S. manufactured. The cells are made in China, like most PV cells in the world today. But we actually manufacture the actual panels from those cells, and all our components, racking, everything as a system, just north of Detroit, Michigan. Okay. We, as a thermal business, what you want to do is concentrate on the key users of hot water. So if you guys are all in PV, here's a whole new business for you. You want to go after industrial users, residential, commercial buildings, large residential complexes, apartment buildings and hotels, for example. We'll help you train on product knowledge and share sales successes and techniques, along with the other guys. You know, we're not the only game in town. There's all the existing thermal providers, Heliodyne, Falco, a lot of other manufacturers, all the thermal installers that are out there, and are actually very successful. So there's still, though, a lot of market that could be reached. Typically, you want to solve your thermal need first and then do PV after. If you're doing an all-electric home, you can use your PV to go ahead and take care of your electrical need for heat. However, it's still more efficient, 4-to-1, to first help that thermal need, that domestic hot water and or pool, using a hot water collection system. The sun always generates 4 times more heat than anything we can do with PV, you know, square footage for square footage. Attend key user groups, conference, trade shows, and meetings like the one we're after. And if you want to reach these customers, go to some of the real estate events, laundry events, manufacturers, car washes, things like that. Go to their trade shows. Number one, you can sell them some PV. And in the meantime, you can also sell them some thermal, I hope. Key tactics. Personally, we've had success initially targeting local real estate owners, managers and developers. Well, with the mandate, they're the people that have to do this. So help them do it, and you can be in first position, you know, to get the business. I would say offer to do smaller deals one at a time in order to get entire portfolios in the pipeline. I can't tell you how many times I've started off with deals where the owner said, "Oh, I want PV in my house." Sure. You know, you give me enough of your buildings, I'll give you your house system for free. You know, why not? Go after increasing larger deals as opportunities present themselves. And of course, advertise through your typical e-blast, magazine articles, radio shows, attendance at trade shows and conferences, targeted mailers. You'd be surprised. Every homeowner out there wants to save money. You know, I don't know anybody that doesn't. And so they're very receptive to these new technologies and new ideas. And one good thing is that as the mandate has now been developed, existing homeowners, you know, when they come time to sell their house, they've got to compete with all the new houses out there. We already do. So this is another way that, you know, hey, oh yeah, I have free energy when I buy this new house. Well, here, you know, I just added solar to mine, you know, buy my house and it's already here. Informational links. Right now, you get cash rebates a little bit under $4,400 a month on solar water heating systems. And this is for single-family residential. Multifamily commercial properties actually qualify for rebates up to $800,000 on solar water heating systems. And pools heating systems qualify for rebates up to $500,000. Now, of course, to get to this size, it's got to be an apartment complex or a hotel. It's got to be a pretty big pool. You know, you're not going to get $500,000 for a house pool unless you're, you know, unless you're Bill Gates. So everybody else has to take a smaller rebate. But hopefully you got a smaller pool. And just for more information on this, you know, contact your local solar thermal provider. They're right up on the California Solar Initiative thermal website, listing of contractors and other people that can help you make this happen. A lot of people probably heard of gosolarcalifornia.org. We're, of course, under solar water. The CSI Thermal Handbook. We have a special handbook just for thermal, and it's geared more towards the industry, not for individual, you know, home users. So for the people in this room, I'm sure that's a great guide that you would want to look at. And then in terms of maximizing your returns, look at CSI's Thermal Low Income Program, which is actually easily found by going to the cpuc.california.gov website using that link there. This is also downloadable if you'd like. I have both the presentation and the notes in a PDF file, so you can use that as well. And I'd like to finally say my name again is Richard Brown. I operate under Sunworks International Solar Consulting. You can actually get me best by rbrown@richnetgroup.com. And for more information on the PVT panels, go to PowerPanel's website at www.powerpanel.com.
Thanks,
And
Rich.
thank you very much.
Appreciate it. All right, Megan, if you want to talk a little bit more about the options for builder compliance from the builder point of view, that'd be great.
Thanks. So I'm Megan Cordes, and I'm the Standards Technical Lead for CBIA, as Kelsey mentioned. So what we do is during the rulemaking process that the Energy Commission goes through, we provide input, feedback, technical support to the CEC, just to give them the perspective that the builders are taking on what they're proposing. We work with them to address any potential issues or conflicts within the code. It's a really collaborative process, and it always goes really well. It's never adversarial. So after adoption, we support the building industry by working with the CEC, manufacturers, other stakeholders like building officials and things like that, to ensure a smooth transition to the new standards. So in order to talk about 2019, I quickly want to go back to 2016 and just talk about how those shaped what we're doing now and what we're going to be doing to comply with 2019. So in 2016, the Energy Commission does a triennial update of the standards. So the 2019 standards introduced the solar mandate, but in 2016, they introduced solar as a compliance option. So it was a limited credit, but the key was that it offset efficiency features. So you were allowed to install PV instead of a high efficiency window, for example. At the same time, they introduced new efficiency measures that were a really big leap for the building industry, and that was high performance attics and walls. So a lot of builders, in looking at this, were like, well, I could do PV or I could do high performance attics and walls, and this is in 2016. In 2019, that trade-off doesn't exist. But because of that, what builders are doing now, a lot of the builders have decided that they wanted to do solar instead of those efficiency measures. So 25 to 35% of new residential starts have solar right now. A lot of the production builders that we talk to have solar as a standard option, and they're used to it, and those builders are ready for 2019. They'll just have to ramp up their efficiency features to where everybody else is right now. Most production builders that we talk to are using the lease option. It provides an opportunity for low or no upfront cost, which is attractive to builders. You know, they like to cut costs where they can. The chart here, I don't know if you can see how big it is on there, but this is showing the housing starts. CURB is the Construction Industry Research Board, and they collect permit data and publish it on a monthly basis, and then also in an annual report. So from 2015 to 2016 to 2017, we saw healthy growth, just incrementally getting more and more units every year. And so the 2018 is for the first half of 2018. And if you double those numbers, we're on track to, again, go up a little bit. Freddie Mac just released some statistics showing that housing has essentially stalled in the United States. So in California, that's because of lot shortage, labor shortage, rising costs across the board. So we anticipate that in 2018, we may not actually exceed 2017, but in the next few years, we'll either stay pretty steady or even decline just a little bit in starts. Still a healthy market, and the share of PV is just going to keep going up. So in preparation for 2019, we're going to ramp up that approximate 30% to effectively 100%. There are the exceptions, but most of the exceptions only allow you to reduce the system size, and the rest of them, there aren't going to be a ton of builders that are going to use those exceptions to get out of the solar requirement. So why I'm saying 0 to 24 months after January 1st, 2020, and I think that was mentioned by both Joe and Mozzie, is on December 31st, 2019, builders are just going to pull a bunch of permits. Those permits last for 6 months. You can get extensions. So what we've seen in past code cycles is there's kind of a slow ramp up from the effective date to about 18 months after the effective date. And that's when we see basically full implementation of the new code. The governor just signed, I was just telling Mozzie, the governor just signed legislation that increases that permit length from 6 to 12 months, given the labor shortage and some of the other issues we're having with getting homes built. So I would anticipate that that 18 months average is going to be a little longer this time around. So we could be into the end of 2021 before we start to see full implementation of the standards. A couple of options that we're looking at in complying with this requirement. We mentioned community solar already. This is attractive to builders because it's a low-cost option. There are still some people that don't like seeing solar on rooftops, but not that many. But community solar is attractive as a lower-cost option. It isn't yet viable. At this moment, there are some conflicts between what the IOUs can do under the CPUC regulations and what the Energy Commission is requiring as part of the community solar option. So CBIA and the Energy Commission are kind of collaboratively working on getting a lot of people in the room to discuss this and make sure that this is a viable option when the standards go into effect. And so we have, 2 or 3 years to get there, and we're making progress. So hopefully that's a viable option when we get there. We're also going to start looking into batteries. They have a pretty small market share today. One draw for builders is that they will provide a grid harmonization credit, which will allow you to offset efficiency features just like the solar credit did in 2016. So builders are really into as many options as possible. So the battery grid harmonization credit just presents one more option. And as Joe was mentioning, you put a battery in, you can reduce your system size by 25%. You can also increase it by 1.6. That'll help you get to reach codes, and could provide other options for the builders. The last bullet there is just increase efficiency, which we do every 3 years. There's not a huge increase this cycle, so mainly we're focusing on PV and batteries and other options like that. So I put this together to kind of visualize, because the EDR metric that Mozzie was discussing is new for builders, and a little bit confusing. And I imagine for the solar industry who doesn't deal with Title 24, it's probably even more confusing. So the first dotted line is the target you need to hit to get to the EDR, is the EDR target that you need to hit, and you can only use efficiency features to get there. The second dotted line is the final EDR, and you can use efficiency features or renewable features. Once you pass the first dotted line, it's not cost effective to use efficiency features anymore. So basically we're going to see efficiency on one side and renewables and batteries on the other side. The purple circles, and these are, the size of the circles is proportional to the size of the credit that you get. So the purple circles are efficiency features that builders will kind of combine, use one, not the other, to get to that first target. And I included the battery credit in there. That's that grid harmonization credit that allows you to use some of your battery credit to offset your efficiency features. And then the renewable features, just the PV system will get you from one dotted line to the other, but battery is an option that you can put in there to provide more flexibility. This is something that we did for a builder who's looking at doing a couple of 2019 test homes to look at the different options and what they cost. So this puts cost to the size numbers that we just looked at. The base case is just a 2019 compliant home, and then you can see the incremental cost to go from just a regular compliant home to different options and what the cost difference would be. So the first option is all electric, and so we just replaced a gas furnace and water heater, and the appliances are all electric. You'll notice along the bottom that the solar system size is the same in all these cases because what you do with the efficiency features is not going to affect your solar system size requirement. This is just a requirement for compliance, so you can increase the system size if you want. It just doesn't have any effect on compliance. So an all-electric home will get you some credit. You can trade off some efficiency features, and it'll be about $1,600 extra above the cost of a regular compliant home. If you use a battery, you can reduce a bunch of the features using the grid harmonization credit. So you're going to save money on some efficiency features, but due to the cost of the batteries right now, you're still going to spend an extra $3,300. The last option is just an unvented attic, which isn't exciting for you guys, so we don't really need to talk about it too much. But that's just a different way of doing an efficient attic, and it'll save you $494. But in all of these cases, the solar system is a requirement, and the size will not be any lower than that unless you choose to install a battery and reduce the size. So that's it for me. If you have any questions, let me know. And otherwise.
Thank you, Megan. All right, Matt, if you would tell us a little bit about the marketing or the market opportunities for the solar industry with the new mandate.
Okay. Full disclosure, I'm a sales guy. I don't have a bunch of pretty pictures to present. They're numbers and charts, so bear with me. We have been doing solar in new homes for about 10 years. We've installed about 40,000 systems for builders, mostly in the state of California. So we speak from a little bit of experience serving this segment. I'd say a significant amount of the information has been covered in here, so I'm going to try to move through this quickly so we have enough time for questions. What you see here is the chart on the right, which is basically 60-year historical housing data. And what's important to point out is that it's very cyclical. You can see there's highs and lows. The lows happen in a recession. The highs happen when the economy's doing well. If you look to the left, this is the single-family starts that we've talked about, and Megan just kind of covered this. On average, we're at like 102,000 over the last 17 years. So in 2017-18, we're right around the average. So this means we're basically in a healthy market. But we see if it's stabilized, right? And we don't really tend to see the market stabilize for this long. So I'm expecting over the course of the next few years, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be estimating that period. So for the purpose of this presentation, what I want to give you is an idea of what's going to happen in the future, not what's happened already, right? So what is the market opportunity for solar companies? How do we look at who's building what? And a lot of this is predicated on what happens in the next few years. It's true that the housing market has stalled, and so we might see 2018 or 19 be worse. Well, it's hard to say right now. So we looked at some market data that we get and to talk about who's building actually all these homes. We've got 100,000 homes. One thing I failed to mention in the previous slide is that half these homes are multifamily. Previously, they were not. Half the market was not multifamily. So we're seeing a significant increase in the number of, or the percentage of total homes being attached product. We looked at the data that we used to sort of assess, where we're going to be targeting. We took the top 20 home builders for 2018. They represent 60% of the homes being built. We then looked at the next 100 builders who built homes through 2018, and we found that, that's only 20% of the homes that are being built, right? So small number, large percentage, and then you move into the middle. This is your medium-sized regional, probably production home builders, maybe some larger multifamily builders, and they're 20%. And then you've got basically a really fragmented rest of your market, right? Almost 1,200 builders representing 20% of the market. So I think it's just kind of important to dissect the market a little bit and understand how that plays. And then the last point is that multifamily is, it's part of all this. The data doesn't necessarily say where it is in these, but multifamily, as we saw before, is going to be roughly half of these homes being built throughout the course of the year. All right. So let's talk about sizing the market. First thing I want to say is, unlike residential, where you have a ton of information on residential, solar installations that are going on, a lot of companies like Green Tech and everything tracking it, you can get reports, that sort of thing. It doesn't exist for residential new construction, and because it hasn't really been a market to date, right? Well, that might change. We actually have a substantial market now. What you're seeing here is some bar charts where if every single home being built in 2017 through 22 got a 2.5 kW, 2 kW system for multifamily and 3.5 kW system for single family, you'd have roughly a 300 megawatt market, right? I've talked about, we've done a lot of homes in the last 10 years, and what were the drivers for doing that? Megan already mentioned the 2016 code. There was a significant credit in the 2016 code for builders to implement solar, and they started doing that. The new Solar Home Partnership was a $400 million rebate program. It expired earlier this year, but builders leveraged that $400 million to learn how to do solar, or a lot of them did, not all of them. A lot of them are beginning to plan ahead. So if you look at 2019, why is the 2019 market share growing, or the served available market? It's growing because builders are preparing for 2020, and they're jumping on early because they're starting to see homeowners want solar homes. What you can also see in that chart is that most of the served available market right now in blue is single family. We're seeing a much higher percentage of single family, and I would say even within single family, most of what you're seeing in single family are the production builders who are doing it. It's not as much the custom and small production builders who are actually implementing solar today. So then we talk about what's going to happen over the next few years, and I get the question all the time, 2020, and it's been covered in here, oh, it's going to be the boon for the solar industry. Well, actually, we're going to see this phase in pretty slowly. Every time there's a code cycle change, we see a very slow phase in. So we're estimating based on our phase-in estimates, which are similar but different from everybody else's, and Jerry Brown signing this language recently sort of changes that by extending the time in which you can pull a permit, right? We're looking at more like a 100 megawatt market in 2020 and more like a 280 megawatt market in 2022 because it's going to take that amount of time to phase in. Multifamily projects are going to phase in even slower because of the permitting cycle that they go through. And you can see some of the assumptions that have been made down below. So if we take that 2020, we look at the 120 megawatt market, we look at 2022, the 180, and we break that out, you can kind of see who's going to be building what. And this is where, if you're a solar company in here, and you're going to have to start thinking about, well, who's my customer, right? Because you don't just go after new homes in California. You probably want to have some idea of how your company fits into the market, which company profile best suits you, and go after that type of customer. So when you look at large production, these are big builders, right? These are national builders. They build in many states. Usually they tend to have several divisions within the state of California. They're very sophisticated buyers. They actually have quite complex operations to integrate your business into. They just think about plumbing, right? They have relationships with Moen and Kohler. You think about HVAC, they basically tend to go to one HVAC company. They do a deal with Trane or Carrier, right? Anything as a manufacturer, they really like manufacturer relationships. It may be a little bit less so until this becomes a national thing that goes into every single home, but they definitely prefer to have be at the manufacturer because they know that they're getting the best deal buying straight from the manufacturer. I would also say about this group is that they're the most prepared of any group that I'm going to talk about right now. They are always planners. They're planning ahead for code cycles. Small production, very similar, I think, in some ways to large production. These are more of your regional guys, right? So they don't have such a big footprint. They might, have a couple hundred or 100-mile area that they're serving or something like that. Generally been in business quite a while, some of the smaller production builders. They have strong relationships in their markets with trade partners who have been serving them for a long time. Those same trade partners are coming in now with solar solutions that they didn't have prior to that. But in general, I think similar production requirements, and also, I'll get to it in the next one, which is the small custom, and I kind of talk about the sales cycle. In all of these, you have to plan for a really, really long sales cycle, right? From the time you put a proposal out to get a contract to actually get, a system installed could be 4 months, it could be a year. And that's one of the challenges of this segment is the patience that's required to get to where you need to be. But in small custom, these are generally one home, 5 homes being built within, a few zip codes or a zip code or something like that. These we're finding are much more reliant on sort of the Title 24 and architects. They're going to do their plans. They're going to tell them what size has to go into that home to meet code. They're going to get that, and they're going to go out and ask basically bidders to provide that for them. Now that's not obviously, larger custom, maybe more sophisticated homes will be more, but those are going to be probably 1.5 year, 2 year builds. I would also say that Large production, very much financing, as Megan mentioned, a lot of them are doing leasing, it's very true. I'm guessing, or I'm seeing small custom is going to be more of your, they're going to be buying it, they're going to be putting it in the home, they're going to be dealing with financing programs as much. And then the big, this is almost like you could break this category down just like the other one in another 3 or 4 buckets, is multifamily. Super diverse, you've got market rate housing, you've got lease housing, you've got apartment rentals, you've got affordable, all falling under basically the code of three and less stories, having to comply with this. So those are all different market actors or target audiences. Then you get into these being more commercial. So these are generally not like a single family rooftop. You've got TPO rooftops, you've got 3 stories, maybe carports. So you're looking definitely more like commercial installations, different type of salesperson you need to send into that than you need to send into a builder, because you're offering different products and solutions. And then complexities. I mean, you think about in most multifamily, it's owned by the homeowners association, the roof is. So there's some complexities. A lot of them lend themselves to virtual net metering. You've got cycle time. So the other thing on multifamilies, we see, they take quite a while to build. You oftentimes have retail, commercial, common space, pool buildings, that sort of things being built with these things, which make them extremely long, lots of trips and cycle time on these jobs. But will be bigger in general than what you would see. So the last thing we for sure see is constrained rooftops in multifamily. They're using every last space of the lot that they're buying for the units. So oftentimes the roof's congested with AC units and you name it. There's limited parking on site, and so just constraints overall. And maybe those will be ones that lend themselves to the community type solar programs. So that's really basically what I wanted to share. That's the way I would kind of quickly break down the market for you, leaving about 10 minutes for questions.
Thank you. I'm going to ask the group one question, and then we can see if the audience has any questions. We're talking a little bit at lunch, so I'm interested in what you have to say on stage about this. How often do you think builders will choose community solar over on-site solar?
So I'll take a crack. But currently, there are no approved community solar plans. So until that happens, that's not going to be an option. And then, assuming that it will happen, it may, it's going to present 2 different marketing opportunity for the builders. So it becomes a matter of what's the builder's philosophy, if they want to just comply with the standards in a minimal way and present that to their buyers, or if they want to have a system where it has an on-site PV system, which may cost a little bit more, but also provides a bigger monthly savings on an ongoing basis. So it's really going to be the choice of the builders and their buyers. So at this time, and I'll be hesitant to make a prediction because, again, we don't even have a eligible community solar plan at this time.
I think a lot of builders take a lot of different things into account when they choose which measures to use. For example, we'll put together a cost effectiveness analysis for builders, and we'll rank them from most cost effective to least cost effective, and they'll sort of generally follow that, but then there will be something that's super not cost effective, but they'll do it all the time. One, because they're familiar with it. Or another one is because they don't like the liability of the other options. 3, they don't have anybody that knows how to do something, or they just do things for a lot of different reasons. So I don't anticipate that there's going to be a huge lean one way or the other, especially since it's not viable yet, so we can't really talk to builders about what it would look like and how they would react. I do know that if it's a lower cost option, it is going to be really attractive. So that's like not really an answer, but I don't think I can put a number on it.
I was going to say that we do have some CM member companies that are focused on community solar in other parts of the U.S. And so some of those companies may be eager to find builder partners to kind of be the early adopters or the first movers. But I think that we need to recognize that in addition to community solar integrators and installers wanting to partner with builders, there's also some work to do on contractual legal obligations. So I had already mentioned that there's some work to do on behalf of, say, CALSA and SEIA in the legislature to make sure that the policy and the law is set up correctly. But then having early in my career worked 7 years on the other side of the counter in the building department, I also can see that if the community solar is off-site and it's somewhere else, and it could even be distant, and that is substituting for the on-site solar, the building department is going to want to have some assurance that those things are legally tied to each other and bound to each other. However, the building department's not going to want to go too deep in that. So I do think that we have some work to do, not only in the legislature, but also kind of in laying out the groundwork for how do these legal contracts come together? What is the consumer protection aspect of that is tied to it? And then work with those early adopters or first movers to kind of pave the way to getting this to be a greater implementation.
Thank you. Anyone in the audience have any questions for us? We got one back there.
Thank you. Oh, wow. So as this program is designed, I'm curious about, as the builders, just the certainty that's provided for risk mitigation and just kind of ability to invest and confidence in that investing. Do you see quite a bit of that happening so far? There's still some kind of sticky points that there's program aspects that you really don't know whether or not that's going to take off. You mentioned to it briefly, but yeah, any thoughts?
Are you talking about community solar specifically, or just
programmatically in general, so either community solar or just residential aspects? I guess sounds more like community solar.
Yeah, I think community solar is kind of a whole different thing that we've never done before, and they are very concerned about liability and pretty conservative about that sort of thing. As far as solar overall, no, I don't think there are any concerns because we've got a pretty good market uptake so far, and we've been doing it for a while.
All right. Any other questions from our audience? Aha, a question. Go ahead.
So in regard, probably more for like Matt, in regards to, I guess, like the business development, and so Power has been doing it for a long time. How do you see it playing out as far as the connection between whether it's installers or finance companies or manufacturers? I mean, how does the panel feel about how that business development is going to happen between now and 2020, and who's going to be the majority, stakeholder in getting that business? I mean, is it coming from panel manufacturers? Is it coming from finance? Is it coming from small contractors who are regional? I mean, if you can talk to that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's why I shared that last slide, because every one of those four markets, the big builders, the medium builders, the custom, and the multifamily is going to be served completely differently. And so while, yes, production housing, the 60% is the larger single-family builders, I think you're going to have probably a few players in there that will have a substantial share, and it's going to be based on, a strategy that is taken a long time to put together and figure out. Like I said, they're operationally complex, to work with a D.R. Horton, for example, who's building, 4,000 homes, and they build their homes in 45 days, and you've got 14 communities. You kind of have to have your act together to be able to keep up with that. That's a completely different than, a regional builder, maybe a production builder that's builds only in Fresno, that you could actually serve with a regional team, right? And not doing that kind of volume and not building at that pace. So I actually think there's room for a lot of different companies, but you better really know your customer and understand your strategy. Hopefully that helps.
I do think that's a really interesting question because solar companies historically have decided, like some of the major companies, what is the service area where we see a market and where we want to establish, and set up shop. And there's a whole series of moves that are required. I mean, the market survey, setting up a warehouse and a lease on that, setting up vehicle fleets, employees, supply chain. And so typically those companies have a certain service area that is their preferred service area, and they don't really want to go outside that service area. One of the things I have in another one of my presentations is the question of, as solar is required throughout the entire state of California, who's going to provide the service in the foothills of the Sierras, where the major manufacturers and suppliers might not go? Who's going to install solar on a new house in Needles, California, or Weed, or some of those other far distant places? And I think that as I think that through, it seems to me that, first of all, we're going to be talking about smaller businesses that supply that need. And it seems to me only natural that roofing companies are going to see this as an opportunity in those areas that whether either they are or are not served by the majors. So I think we're going to see the market shift, and I think we're going to see a lot of opportunities in all regions of California.
Another question over here?
With this new mandate for residential solar, and only about 25 or 30% of your daytime use is covered by solar, all that excess will be basically then what, exported back to the grid? Wouldn't that just further degrade the duct curves you've shown and cause a lot more strain on utilities? So to me, why don't they mandate no export to make the house more efficient by using multiple storage techniques, thermal storage, et cetera? So I just find that the mandate is very lacking in trying to achieve what they want to achieve.
So, there are a couple of things we've done to address that. One of them is, again, the right sizing the PV system by making it only a 2.8 kilowatt PV system, so it would have a less impact. Now, we looked at grid harmonization strategies such as battery storage. We would have liked to make it a mandatory requirement, but batteries are still too expensive. So, they're not cost effective. But
what's the cost for what you have for batteries then? Why are you saying it's too expensive? What number do you have? What number do you have for dollar per watt for batteries?
So, what we do is we use life cycle costing methodology.
Sure, yes.
And so what we need to demonstrate is that for any measure, the benefits are greater than the cost on a life cycle
at
cost
18
basis.
cents per kilowatt hour?
So 18 cents is roughly the average retail statewide. So, we looked at that, and the batteries still do not pencil out. Now, in the future, they might, but there are other things still you can do. You can do thermal storage. You can do pre-cooling, where you pre-cool your house during the day when we're not home, and you can pre-cool it by 3, 4, 5 degrees. And these are very efficient homes. You got high-performance attics, you got high-performance walls. It's a thermos, basically. So you can pre-cool it using, instead of sending that electricity back to the grid, you can pre-cool it, and you can coast through the hottest part of it. Actually, I'm doing it in my own house, and it works. And mine isn't a very good house. And I've done some stuff to it, but it's not a 2019 compliant home. But I do have a PV system that's sending back. So I'm using that strategy by just programming my thermostat. And we have all access to this Nest thermostat. On our cell phones, you can have access to it. I turn it on, and so there's different things you can do. Again, thermal storage, you can use that excess PV generation to generate more hot water during the day, and then superheat your water heater up to around 150 degrees Fahrenheit and store it, and then when you go home to do cooking, washing dishes, you use that instead of using electricity from the grid. So there's interim steps we can take right now, and we're hoping in a few years, by the next cycle, perhaps the cost of the battery storage system is coming down to the point that we can make it a prescriptive requirement. The good news is that when we walk downstairs in that corner where there was all the storage manufacturers, a lot more manufacturers are paying attention to it. There are a lot more choices, and the prices are coming down. But at the time when we were focusing or considering this, it just wasn't penciling out. In the future, it might.
Yeah, and I think an important takeaway there is, remember, thermal. Thermal is free. Thermal doesn't require pumps. A simple drain back system. It's very easy, especially in a single family home situation, to increase the size of that storage tank and then use it for all the purposes that you need water for, or just as like a thermal energy storage battery in a sense. And water is cheap.
No, again, that's my point, because in Hawaii, they do mandate every new home have thermal hot water.
Yeah.
So I'm just surprised that California left that part out.
I agree with you.
It just seems, yeah. And again, and 70% is going to be sent back to the grid because of the daytime. So I just found it lacking.
Thermal is, for all effects, might as well be mandatory in the Caribbean.
So,
You're crazy if you don't.
again, we didn't leave it out. It is possible here to, again, use the PV output to generate hot water and get a compliance credit for it. And that software that I just demonstrated, will handle all of that. So, you can do that. It's just not a mandatory requirement, but it's what we call a compliance option.
And thermal systems still have a compliance credit in the standards, just as they have for decades, in this new energy design rating, or EDR method. It's going, the solar water heating, the efficiency measures are typically space heating, space cooling, water heating. And so water heating is on that efficiency side of the EDR score. There continues to be a compliance credit for thermal on the efficiency side. And then on the renewables and grid integration or harmonization side will be PV and batteries. But the other thing I wanted to mention is that I do codes and standards, so I'm sticking my neck out a little bit if I talk about policy. But I think also speaking to your question is, we all recognize that we're going to have to dealing with a post-net metering world. And so SEIA and member companies recognize that batteries are playing a much more important role, and that, of course, is why this conference itself has evolved into Solar Power International and Energy Storage International. So we see batteries as an ultimate, important part to go with the PV, and I think that kind of addresses your question.
All right. That's all the questions we have left for, but please feel free to come up and talk to our panelists after this. Thank you, everyone, for being a part of this panel, and thanks for coming.
Thank you.